Welcome to the Climate Report. This is Hart Hagen, and I'm here with Judith Schwartz, and this is our second of two conversations. This time we're going to talk about water, and I want to give a personal testimonial here. It was 3 or 4 months ago, Judith, that I read your book, Cows Save the Planet, and there's one chapter in it about water, and Michael Kravchik is one of the main people in that. It completely reorganized and reoriented my thinking around climate and just I see everything differently now when I drive around and when I work with I do landscaping, so when I work with things. So tell me, how did you encounter this idea that water can be so positive for the climate?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you that it totally upended my thinking too. And as with so many things, I learned about this from a colleague of mine named Peter Donovan, who's one of the co-founders of the Soil Carbon Coalition. And yeah, funny. So I was working on Cow Save the Planet, and I think it was a day when I had a really bad cold. And so I didn't feel like writing. I just wanted to take in material. So I was just looking at the Soil Carbon Coalition website and found references to the New Water Paradigm, which was a publication by these Eastern European scientists. So you mentioned Michael Kravchik, who is a Slovakian hydrologist, and Jan Pokorny, who is a botanist. And I read this document, which is about, I guess, 90 pages, and it completely blew my mind. So yeah, so I put that in the book, and I guess all right, so here's the thing with water.
Lay it on me.
Yeah, and this is what got me, is that when we have the connection, when we make the connection between water and climate change, it tends to go in one direction, which is that climate change will put added stress on water resources throughout the world and change the patterns of water events. Okay, that's hugely important. But what isn't talked about is the impact that water has on climate and the opportunity to work with the water cycle to actually, to enhance nature's water or climate regulation capacity.
Yeah, so words are important. And I've observed how the meaning of climate has changed. The predominant meaning of climate has changed. Used to be climate by definition referred to a regional phenomenon. This place has a different climate from that place. Now, when we hear the word climate, it's thought to be this worldwide phenomenon that's driven by CO2, and everything else is incidental to CO2. So how did we get to this place where we're just solely focused on CO2, and what opportunities do we have to focus more on water, and just how does that work?
Yeah, so it is a really, really interesting question. And one reason as I've picked things up from the scientists that I talk to, is that CO2 is easy to measure. It's easy to model. It's easy to convey the changes. So there is a scientist whose work has informed my work greatly, named Walter Jenne. In Australia,
Right.
from Australia. He's a soil microbiologist. And he observes that, okay, I guess the way I think about it, all right, so I'll get to Walter in a second, but I really feel that kind of so much depends on the kinds of questions we ask. So if we pose the question, how does the earth manage heat? Which, if we're concerned about climate change, would be a reasonable question to pose.
You'd think.
the answer is largely through water-based processes. And Walter Yene talks about this as 95%
Mhm.
of the climate phenomena is driven by hydrological processes. So there we are. But then if we take that further, what drives hydrological processes? That's life. That's
I'm
life.
gonna rant for just a minute. So,
Please.
record droughts in the American West. Drought, by definition, is an absence of water. And all this reportage about droughts, and we're not talking about how we manage water. And there was
This
a
is true.
report on Madagascar. A publication that will remain nameless said that for the first time ever, here's a famine that is caused by climate change, and not recognizing anything about land use, deforestation, the bad ways that we use land. And so one of the surprising things in your book is that forests cause rain. They have certain ways of causing rain. So that's one thing. And another thing is I look around me, and plant matter is a reservoir for water. And if we let plant matter grow strategically, but let nature do its work, and if we and then we're growing a reservoir for water, and then that plant matter contributes that water vapor back into the air, and that causes rain. So why are we not talking about this?
That's an excellent question. And so that's why I wrote the second book after Cows Save the Planet, Water in Plain Sight, for two reasons. One, I mentioned that because I wanted to bring water into the climate conversation, but also it made me nuts that when we talk about drought, no one talks about land. And you can't talk about availability of water without also talking about what we do to the land. So here we've just co-ranted.
Okay, another rant is that when you take climate change and you define that problem narrowly as CO2, and your sole focus is solving that problem, there are so many culprits that are off the hook, you know? So that's my take. But so what can we do? You know, or well, let me talk about some. Okay, there's this thing, evapotranspiration, a big word. How many syllables does that have? Lots of syllables, but it's where, you know, plants transpire water, that water goes into the atmosphere. For one thing, it has a cooling effect. For another thing, it causes precipitation. For another thing, it creates kind of an environment where there's enough moisture to support plants, to support animals. So, and when you go into a forest, it's like, it's cool, not just because of the shade, but because of the water vapor that is gradually changing from liquid to vapor. And that process takes a lot of energy, and it takes sensible heat and hides it and turns it into heat. It's a type of, it's not even heat. It's called like latent heat, but it's not heat that feels hot. It's a form of energy that, and water does us that favor. A big reason, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be interviewing you, but a big reason why this planet is habitable is because of how water regulates temperatures. So it would be great if how can we like take over the world and teach everybody this?
Yeah, well, what I like to do is think about water not as only a noun, but also as a verb, to focus on water processes,
Mhm,
to ask,
mhm.
how does water behave? How does it move across the landscape and through the atmosphere? Because understanding that movement and how that conveys energy, heat, and it conveys heat, it moves heat from one place to another, how that can really help us address our many challenges. So yeah,
And that's one thing I owe it to you for introducing me to this whole subject, and it's my favorite thing now. When you think about water, it's common sense. There's a lot of it's a lot of food for thought, but at root, it's intuitive and it's something that you can see all around you, and you see it everywhere when you start to see things this way.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would also say about the emphasis on CO2 and not including water is I feel that it's disempowering
Exactly.
because once
Talk
we
about that.
understand,
Let's talk about the word agency
yeah,
and disempowerment or empowerment.
yeah. So working with the water cycle gives us tremendous agency because we can restore ecological function, which is of which the water cycle is a huge part
Mhm.
everywhere and at all scales. You can help restore land where you are. You can help cycle moisture, even if you live in an apartment and you can put plants out on your windowsill. So, and I think that's important because the more you see in a small way, the more you observe, the more that you understand how these processes work, and the more that you understand how there are different ways to approach our many challenges that will give us collectively and individually more agency.
So absent that, you have desertification, and that can occur even in a wet climate. But I have a small house and a backyard, and I let my grass grow, not too high, but I let it grow. It's 8 or 10 inches on average, and then I bring in brush and logs and stuff like that, and I feel like I'm doing my part because those logs are going to absorb water, the brush absorb water. It kind of creates a little humid environment so that ants and other insects and worms can thrive. And but so I have agency. And another type of thing is that, like on the community level, it's like, can we please like stop cutting everything down, because that's our source of water.
Right, right. That water is embodied in plants. And with when you have water embodied in plants, that creates the conditions for greater biodiversity and more water to be cycled.
So that water has a cooling effect. How can that possibly? We hear that, we're locked into this idea that CO2 and greenhouse gases are causing climate change and causing climate change. And but Walter Yenny and others are saying that yes, we have a warming climate and we need to deal with carbon, but water has a cooling effect that is substantial. So how can we convince me that there's enough scale there, that there's enough, that water has the power to actually cool the planet?
Okay, so I'm going to quote another Australian whose name is Peter Andrews, who's written a couple of brilliant, very brief books, Beyond the Brink and Back from the Brink. So in one of his books, I don't remember which, he writes that water, wait, no, plants manage water.
Mhm.
And in managing water, they are managing heat. That's a very economical way of describing that evapotranspiration dynamic. So, okay, I'm convincing you. I just lost my train of thought because I like that quote so
Well,
much.
okay, Walter Yenny says that, he says like 90%, like that if you look at the heat dynamics of the earth, then depending on who you talk to, it is agreed that water governs somewhere between 75 and 95% of the heat dynamics on earth. So why are we not taking advantage of that to cool the earth down?
Okay, I
So,
will say that Walter Yene has a document where he describes 10 different ways to work with
hmm.
the water cycle to promote cooling. And it's really, I mean, just one that I remember is when you can rehydrate, when you a landscape, that means that in brittle environments, and we're talking about places like California, like the Southwest, like many areas that are vulnerable to drought and fire. Um, so when you can hold more water in the landscape, what that also means is that you can extend the period of green growth, extend the which is important for many reasons
Right,
because
by a factor of like 10. If you can extend the period in which the ground is able to stay moist and continue to nurture the plant growth, then that's huge, isn't it?
it's huge, because then you have more photosynthesis happening, which means more drawing down carbon, which means more ability to hold moisture. It also means that there's a shorter period when the grasses or any plants are dormant and dry, which means less chance for fire. So you're creating huge resilience. So rehydrating landscapes is just a huge part of the solution, which also brings us to biodiversity. When you're rehydrating landscapes, you're supporting biodiversity, because we know that when you have in desertification, you are losing the capacity to maintain biodiversity, to sustain plant and even microbial life. So, but what's also
It's a system,
it's
it's a virtue, and things feed upon each other if we do it right. Nature
right.
does a
And
lot of the work if we don't like destroy its ability to do that work.
right. And what's interesting is that not only so not only does the healthy water cycle promote biodiversity, but biodiversity helps promote a healthy water cycle, which was surprising to me. So you look at creatures from beavers to prairie dogs, earthworms, all kinds of life that creates you know, passageway. Well, beavers, of course, are
Mhm.
creating wetlands, and
Right,
prairie dogs and crawling insects and worms are creating pathways that slow down the water and keep it in the landscape.
right. So we ought to, there was you quoted a king from like 900 years ago that said, every drop of water, we ought to, whenever the rain falls, we ought to keep every drop of water on the landscape that we can before it goes to the ocean. Every drop of water ought to serve the people before it goes to the ocean. So the way
Right.
I say that is we need to design for hydration, not drainage. We've designed everything for drainage, and we're draining water off of the landscape, and where the landscape is becoming increasingly dry. And
Yeah, that's true. And that's one of the things that the new water paradigm community really highlighted, is the way that our built environment is all about getting rid of water as rapidly as possible. And the way that we've paved over and built over so much of our land, that we're working backwards, that we need to hold the water on the land. And um, by in bringing that intention back to the way that we manage our built environments and agricultural environments and rangelands, etc., then we can start to really see make a difference in a positive way.
right. So a couple of things that I want to throw this out if it's fresh in your mind. You talk about animal engineers, including beavers and prairie dogs. So what did you learn about how animals can engineer the environment for water?
Yeah, so I'm still learning new ways. So I mentioned that I'm very interested in the wild donkeys in Australia. So there's a Australian land manager that I've written about named Chris Hengler, and his land, Kachana Station, which is huge. it's the size of the 5 boroughs of New York. He's been working to restore this landscape. And one of the challenges that he has is wildfire. Okay, this is Australia. That's a
Right.
big challenge that they
Right.
have. And so he's found that he can use his cattle, which he calls middle management, to help keep down the vegetation that would be fire fodder. Now, there are areas that the cattle won't go, such as in the upper river catchment areas. And what happened is that these wild donkeys, which are considered pests in Western Australia, showed up. And they are helping to manage they are helping, resist fire, because they are cycling the vegetation, they are bringing moisture through their waste. So, and then by eating the plant material so before it dries out, they're keeping down that potential fire hazard. Now, also, what scientists have learned about these wild donkeys is that they dig wells. So they want water. So they are digging wells. And those wells are providing water for a lot of other species that are also under threat because of very dry conditions, the aridification of the landscape. So those animals are thriving. So it's very interesting that the government of Western Australia is determined to eradicate the wild donkeys, whereas these animals have showed up and they want to
Right.
help. The Australian government says that these donkeys are bad for biodiversity, but they're actually supporting biodiversity. I mean, there are all these other ways. So their behavior on the landscape, kind of, they're breaking down plant material and kind of trampling, and that is good, creates good conditions for some of the small marsupials that like to kind of burrow. And so
there's that.
yeah.
Tell me about the Russian scientists who have this theory called the biotic pump, where forests actually attract rain to them. How does that work, and why is it important?
Yeah. So what is really important is to understand the role that transpiration that we've talked about, the upward movement of water through plants, that kind of small water cycle, how important that is in driving in the movement of water. So there are other scientists who have determined that most rain that falls is derived not originally from the ocean, but from other plants, that as the plants are moving this moisture. So the biotic pump is a theory that looks at evapotranspiration, observes that the transpiration of forests, which is a lot of plants transpiring at the same time, creates a low pressure zone that pulls in moisture. Okay, so the trees are moving, they're pulling in moisture. So you've got what they describe is that, so you've got water in the ocean, in bodies of water, and moisture in the forests. And it's almost like a tug of war. Where will the moisture go? And the forests are pulling moisture. So, in mountainous areas, you often get more rain. So this is a part of the reason that forested areas, I didn't quite explain it. I'm conflating mountainous areas with, many mountainous areas. I live on a mountain, it's very forested, that we're pulling in moisture. So if you look at where we're getting rain, it's often areas with a lot of forests, healthy forests.
Right. So, another factor is this, Walter Yenny talks about this bacterium that comes from trees, I believe, and it tends to cause precipitation. So that's another way in which so you have the
Right.
transpiration, you have this bacterium, which tends to form, rain doesn't just fall, it needs something, a nucleus, and the bacteria is part of that. In the ocean, it's like salts form a nucleus, and there's like 3 different ways this can happen, but I think he determined that like over half of the rain in the world is caused by this bacteria that comes from the leaves of trees.
Right, and aerosols. Right. So there's another scientist, Antonio Nobre, who works in Brazil, and he wrote a brilliant document about the future climate of Amazonia, and it does address the biotic pump. And just to give you a sense of how powerful this is, that the Amazon rainforest creates, I think, much more moisture than is embodied in the Amazon River.
Hmm. Right.
So it's creating all this moisture. And he talks about these aerosols that become precipitation nuclei because a raindrop needs to form around something. He calls it fairy dust or scents of the forest.
Hmm.
So it's interesting to see how ecosystems have within them the capacity to maintain themselves. So we're in healthy parts of the Amazon rainforest, and I know that there are healthy parts, you've got this cycling of moisture through the water cycle plus the seeding of the rain from the trees themselves.
Right. One other thing. So you went to Spain and met a gentleman named Millan. And tell me about your trip, and what are the insights that Millan has, that climatologists should know, and what's happening to that environment, which is similar to what's happening in California. And so Yenny calls it a Mediterranean type of climate. California calls California a Mediterranean type of climate. So what are the common themes that we see in those types of climates? And so.
Yeah, so Mian is many things. He's an atmospheric physicist and a climatologist and a real character and a really smart guy who has been around for a while.
Hmm.
So he was showing me documents from the 1970s that talked about the ways that land management impacts climate, and and expresses frustration that line of inquiry had been hijacked by the CO2 discussion. And the way he puts it in his cynical way is that you can talk about CO2 for years and years and years and not do anything about it. Whereas when you talk about land management, then you're dealing with what people are doing, and they want to put hotels up, and they want to, they want to drain the wetlands, and they want to do all that. So anyway, that's his thing. So this line of research that I found particularly compelling is that starting in the 1980s, they observed in the Western Mediterranean, he's based in Valencia, that the weather patterns were anomalous. They started to change. So it used to be that they would get a nice rain every afternoon in the summer. And this was great. You knew what to expect. The farmland nearby never dried out. This was how it worked, and that's how it had always worked. But the rain started to falter and then disappeared. And what Mian's research showed is that we need vegetation to create that rain, and the devegetation, the deforesting, the building up of the covering up of the landscape, the building of towns and resorts and this and that, and the draining of the swamps for farmland when these had been wetlands, that meant that there wasn't enough moisture. So I can put it in the way that he described that. So you have moisture coming off the Mediterranean.
Mhm.
But what he learned is that the moisture coming off the Mediterranean was not enough to generate rain. So
Who'd have thought?
it turned out that the breezes from the sea were picking up moisture from the transpiration over the wetlands, over the forest, over
Hmm.
the different types of plants that were native to that area. And that created that broke over the threshold of enough moisture to generate a rainfall. Otherwise, it just kept going and it would rain at higher elevation as he got further into inland. Or he said it would just go up to through the moisture would go into another water zone and go into Western Europe. And look what we're seeing this
And
year.
no matter where you are, there, even like in arid places, there's this river of vapor. I think Walter Yenny said, there's up to like 50 centimeters of water vapor up there that could rain, except it doesn't unless the right conditions are met.
Right.
So
And we have more power to create those conditions than we knew. So what Mian says is by strategically reforesting and revegetating, but mostly forests, because they're so trees are so powerful at transpiring, they could bring back the rain. Now, this is not a precise science, so you might revegetate and then you'd get rain 70 kilometers lower down, so it's kind of who gets
well,
yeah.
I
So
was asked the other day, Doug Talmy introduced me to the concept that actually, plant matter in a region can increase the precipitation. But I've never like known the specifics. And somebody asked me the other day, like, how big of an area would you have to reforest in order to create that effect? And I'm not sure if there's an answer to that, but it's something we kind of, it's something people are going to be asking,
yeah, there is an answer, and I'm embarrassed. It's in my chapter with Mian in the Reindeer Chronicles, and at this moment I don't have access to it, but we can put it on. I'll find it and we can
Sure.
put it on when you post this. But it's doable. It was
Okay.
not
I've
out of
been meaning to ask you this question. What kinds of things should we be doing in order to create the conditions to take the most advantage of water, get more rain, have more vegetation? What kinds of things do we need to be doing to our landscapes?
I think it depends on what landscape we're on, but I think it begins with asking the right questions. What were these landscapes like when they were thriving? What kind of plants were there? What kind of animals were there? What were the dynamics? What might help us bring us to that place? How can we begin to integrate some of those plants into, because you can't necessarily just start immediately, but start to bring that into the community of life that we have where we are. How might this work?
Okay,
With water, how can we hold more water in the landscape? How can we slow the water down? Because many of our problems come from water moving too fast, when we don't have enough vegetation, when the soil is bare, when the land is desertified, it rushes off. How do we hold that water? How do we rehydrate?
I have to ask you one more question, and that is, I was thrilled when you opened the Reindeer Chronicles book with a chapter on John D. Liu. He is, I love the man. I've encountered him on YouTube, but now, hey, here's a whole chapter about his story. And so tell me specifically, what did they do with the Loess Plateau in China, and what can we learn from that?
Yeah. So, all right. So here we have a scenario where there's hugely degraded land over a large expanse. So the Loess Plateau in China had been the breadbasket of China, and that's where agriculture began 10,000 years ago, around the time that it was developing in the Fertile Crescent. So over millennia, the land was degrading for lots and lots of reasons, and the Chinese government was concerned about this deeply, partly because all of the loess, or kind of granular soil, very granular soil that was eroding, was going into the Yellow River and causing all kinds of problems. So, and also the people who were living in this region were terribly poor.
Yeah.
So, basically the government could keep supporting these people, giving them charity in perpetuity, or they could restore the landscape. So there was this huge top-down effort with hydrologists and ecologists and biologists and chemists and all these experts that were trying to figure out how to restore, just what they could do to get the watershed working better again. So they did it. They applied this, and an area the size of Belgium was restored to ecological function. And John Liu's films are fabulous because he has these nifty
Right.
little clips where you can
Mhm.
see it over time, when you can actually watch.
Before and after, which do you want? Do you want the before or do you want the after?
Right.
And the World Bank, hate to give them credit, they did something right. Financed this to the tune of $500 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but it turns out to be like $17 per hectare per year, or maybe $7 per acre per year, the way that
Yeah, it was
translates. It's a
something incredible.
minuscule amount of money, and it lifted 2 million people out of poverty, something like that. It's a small investment for what you get.
And what they did was extremely simple.
Mhm.
It was terracing, which slowed down the water. It was planting. It was engaging the communities, so people had a stake in it and were working towards a shared goal. And it was taking livestock out of vulnerable areas. So, we want livestock in certain areas managed appropriately, but there are times
Mhm.
when the land could not provide for them. So, I mean, there was like nothing growing.
Well,
So, yeah.
we're going to have, if you have time, we're going to have to come back at a later date and talk about ecosystem restoration. You've been all over the world talking about that, and that includes, like, I like to think all three of your books include, like, all three of the main topics: soil, water, and ecosystem restoration. That it would be great if we could talk about some of your travels in that regard. But Judith, thanks so much for joining me. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
And we will do our part uh, to try to spread the word about the new water paradigm and the opportunities to let nature work with, so to work with nature instead of against nature. We have all this energy coming from the sun, all this solar energy. I think, putting it onto a solar panel is not a proper understanding of what solar energy can do. But we have to work with nature, not against nature, and use our intelligence to do that instead of other things. So, but thanks so much for joining me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you.